Samupada, dependent origination, talk number 19. Buddha taught us the same essence of Dhamma from different angles, based on his desire, different purposes, and the nature of the audience. The discourses on dependent origination, discourse on the five aggregates, and cognitive or thought process. All these three convey the same essence of non-self. However, these are entirely different Dhamma and use different approaches for the same purpose. Dependent origination is about endless cycle of birth and death of being. It explained that self is a natural process, but not a product of creation of Supreme Being. It covers past, present, and future existence. Each existence consists of passive side of life, or vipaka, and active side of life, karma. Passive parts cannot produce karma, and active parts produce karma. That's the difference. Here we'll use human existence as a model of discussion. Passive part of human consists of relinquishing consciousness, mind and matter, six sense basis, mental contact, and feeling. So let us remember these five as the five resultants. So if we say five resultant, we are referring to these fives. Active part of life consists of craving, grasping, and life action. This active and passive, or you can call it karma vipaka, or you can call it cause, chain of cause and effect. This change of cause and effect can be broken by observing feeling, so that it would not cause craving to arise. Or you can observe craving if it has already arisen till it dissolves. That's how one can break that change of cause and effect. Extinction of craving leads to cessation of rebirth, jati. Thus proving self or soul is simply a wrong view. It's not an individual, a person, an entity, a being, but simply a process. So that is the short representation of dependent origination. Now let's go and see about the 5 aggregates. Or sometime you will see the 5 aggregates of clinging, because these aggregates make one cling. So these 5 aggregates of clinging are aggregates of body, aggregates of feeling, aggregates of perception, aggregates of mental contact, and aggregates of consciousness. And all these 5 aggregates are nothing but a composite of mind and matter, hiding under the delusional mask of self or soul. They're just simply mind and matter, but there's a veil. Because of that veil, we believe it's a self or soul. The Buddha taught self or soul in terms of 5 aggregates here. Teaches these 5 aggregates for practicality and also easy to observe tool in determining the demasking the delusion or wrong view of self and soul. So it is more like a tool to use to take the delusion off this concept of self and soul. Thought or cognitive process. It is a fixed principle or a law of consciousness. We teach cognitive process, thought process, is a fixed principle or a law of consciousness. This shows us the precise operational system of thought process. It is not a self or soul operating the thought, operating the speech, and directing the deed. Thought is a natural mental phenomenon, and it is driven by different sets of physical and mental conditions. So this is a summarized representation of the 5 aggregates. Summarized representation of the thought process. So we have summary of the 3 discourse. One is dependent origination, one is the 5 aggregates, and the third one is thought process. Now let's see the connection between the dependent origination and 5 aggregates. We have just discussed passive and active parts of life. That has been explained in dependent origination. Dependent origination, we break it down to passive part and active part. Karma producing and non-karma producing. So let's see how these aggregates and dependent origination are related. Aggregates of body, or you can call it materiality, rupa khanda. This aggregate of body or materiality correspond to the materiality of mind and matter of the five resultants. Materiality of mind and matter, six sense basis of the five resultants of dependent origination. That's your connection. Aggregates of feeling and the feeling of dependent origination are one and the same. Now this next one is a little more complex. That's the phassa, mental contact. When mental contact arises, I believe you all know what it means by mental contact arises. Coming together of the external object, internal object, and corresponding consciousness. That is phassa, mental contact. At that time, also feeling also arises together with it. External object, internal object, consciousness and feeling, they all arises together at the moment of phassa, mental contact. Now, making a mark to cognize this process, of mental contact, maybe rightly or maybe wrongly, is perception. Aggregates of perception, sanya khanda. Okay? All these things, external, internal objects, consciousness, feeling, they arises. And at that time, another department try to remember it, try to mark it, so that they could recognize in future. It could be rightly so, and it could be wrongly so, you don't know, depending on individuals. And that process, and one what is called perception, sanya. So, this aggregates of perception, sanya khanda, correspond to the mind and matter, six sense basis, external, internal, mental contact, and feeling of dependent origination. They are connection, direct connection, group by group. And then the next one is aggregates of consciousness, vijñāna khanda. Okay. That aggregates of consciousness correspond to the relinking consciousness, life continuum consciousness, oinga, and sixth sense consciousness of dependent origination. Okay. They have different terms, but that's how they connect to one another. So in short, aggregates of the body, the feeling, the perception, and the consciousness. Those are the four of the five aggregates, are actually the representation of relinking consciousness, mind and matter, six sense space, mental contact, and feeling, the five resultant, the passive part of dependent origination. Therefore, these four aggregates that we have just described belong to the passive part of life. We are trying to frame each by passive part and active part of life. Now, there's one more aggregates left. That is the aggregates of mental formation, Sankhara Khanda. This aggregate of mental formation correspond to craving, grasping, and life action, the active part of dependent origination. Thus making mental formation active part of life. So in conclusion, five aggregates can be put into the framework of active part of life and passive part of life. Dependent origination is also active part of life and passive part of life. And we show the detailed connection from one to one, a group to a group. Both Dhammas are framed into active part and passive part. What is active part? Karma. What is passive part? Vipaka. Karma, vipaka. Karma, vipaka. Actions and result. Actions and result. Cause and effect. Cause and effect. Okay. Let's move on to the third one. This is just we are correlating between the dependent origination and five aggregates. The third one is cognitive process or thought process, VT. Okay, let's see how this corresponds with the others. Okay, I'm not going to explain the detail. We have discussed each in detail. So, three bhavanga or three life continuum consciousness. They are resultant consciousness. Therefore, they are passive part of life. And then five door adverting consciousness. That is the functional consciousness, and it is the passive consciousness or passive part of life. And then five sense door consciousness. Five sense door consciousness. And then receiving consciousness and investigating consciousness. Three in a row. They are all resultant consciousness, vipaka ceta. Therefore, they are all passive part of life, passive consciousness. So after investigating is determining consciousness. This determining consciousness belongs to functional consciousness. And it belongs to the passive part of life, or you can say passive consciousness. And then there are two registering consciousness. Consciousness number 16 and 17. Two registering consciousness. And these two are resultant consciousness, vipaka citta. And they are passive in nature, or passive consciousness. So all these eight plus 2, 10 are all passive consciousness. 3 bhavinga, 1 adverting, 1 sense consciousness, 1 receiving consciousness, 1 investigating consciousness, 1 determining consciousness, and 2 registering consciousness. They are all passive consciousness, belong to the passive part of a thought process. There are only 10, but we have 17 consciousness or 17 thought moments in our thought process. So the remaining is 7. Those 7 are called 7 swift consciousness or impulsion, whichever name you like to use. These 7 swift consciousness or impulsion, they are active part of the thought process. Active part of the thought process. In other words, those 7 swift consciousness are the ones that are making karma, producing karma. So, if you summarized it, these 17 thought movements we teach or thought process are actually passive and active parts of a thought process. They are simply a single unit representing the passive and active parts of life. In our whole life we have many active parts and passive parts. But this one is just a single thought, active parts and passive parts. So, what is life? Life is innumerable, uncountable numbers of thought processes from the beginning to the end of life, one life, rebirth to death. Everything is a series of thought processes which contain passive parts and active parts. That's a thought process, relationship with the thought process. So let's try and put all 3 Dhamma together. How does this thought process, dependent origination, and 5 aggregates related or connected to one another? So one must be quite familiar with all these discourses to follow this. So 3 bhavinga of the thought process is the same as the relinking consciousness. life continuum consciousness of dependent origination. Adverting consciousness, sense consciousness, indicates the process of mental contact, phassa. How does it indicate? It's just a two consciousness, adverting and sense consciousness. But if you look at it, as soon as you say adverting consciousness, basically consciousness is turning towards adverting, turning towards what? Towards the external sense object coming through the internal sense object. Let's say the form comes through the eye. So the objects that's coming and adverting consciousness turn towards it. So there's a materiality, material object. Adverting consciousness is turning towards what? Materiality, the object. So it's already understood there's a materiality, adverting consciousness. And then sense consciousness. Sense consciousness is based on what kind of door the consciousness turns towards. If it turns towards the eye door, eye consciousness arises. If it turns towards the ear door, ear consciousness arises. So, in short, 6 different kinds of sense consciousness arise based on what door they come through. So that's why even though we say adverting consciousness and sense consciousness, it includes the materiality, turning towards the object coming through the sense door, which gave rise to the sense consciousness. And at that time, at that mental contact, when the object come and strike, it also strike the flow of bhavanga, the flow of life continuum. It strikes that life continuum because as it strikes the life continuum, the bhavanga, life continuum, vibrates for 3 times and stop the flow. That function is also, or operation is also taking place at the same time of that mental contact. It stopped the flow of life continuum consciousness, and in its place arises the sense consciousness. Because consciousness can arise only one at a time. No two can arise together. No two kinds, no two types can arise together. Because of mental contact, the flow of life continuum consciousness is stopped. And in its place, sense consciousness arises. So even though it's just simple one word, there are so many things are happening at the same time. So the bhavanga flow or life continuum flow is stopped and sense consciousness arises at that moment. So all this information, all this happening, okay, except the bhavanga. Bhavanga is undetectable to our conscious mind. All this information along with the feeling, are passed onto the receiving consciousness. And then pass on to the investigating consciousness, and then finally to determining consciousness. All this information goes from one department to the other. And this whole process, okay, these external object, internal objects, striking, cutting of the bowing guard, which is not conscious to a conscious mind. Sense consciousness arises, pass on to receiving, once or to investigating, and then to determining. That whole process, along with the feeling, they are all recorded or marked. And that is perception, sanya. This whole process is marked by aggregates of perception. These are the connection between the three Dhamma. Aggregates of perception, we are talking about 5 aggregates. Consciousness, we are talking about thought process. Therefore, we can conclude, relinking consciousness, mind and matter, 6 sense spaces, mental contact, and feeling of dependent origination, and the materiality or body, feeling, perception, and consciousness, the 4 of the 5 aggregates. And the first 8 consciousness, 3 bhavanga, adverting, sense, receiving, investigating, determining, the first 8. And registering consciousness, number 16 and 17. All these things actually are the representation of the passive part of life. Each Dhamma, they are all different. The 5 resultant from dependent origination, the 4 aggregates, the first 8 consciousness and 16 and 17 consciousness, they are the representation of passive part of life, where no karma can be produced. And the 7 swift consciousness, 7 swift consciousness of thought process, are the different representation of the passive part of life. Was it to represent independent origination, craving, grasping, and life action? That's a passive part of life, or active part of life. Independent origination. And in the 5 aggregates of mental formation, that is the active part of life. So these groups are simply the different representation of active part of life. So let's go again. Craving, grasping, and life action of dependent origination, mental formation of the aggregates, and the 7 swift consciousness of the thought process belong to the active part of life. So, what is active part of life? It is simply the representation of karma. So karma is represented in a different way in 3 different Dhamma. And in this talk, what we are trying to do is trying to connect or correlate between the 3 Dhammas. The commonality, which belongs to what, what's connected to what. Because in the future talk, we'll be connecting these or using these different Dhamma of the 3 different mental states of these 3 Dhamma appropriately as it is necessary, switching, jumping, connecting one to the other. That's why we give a separate talk, how these 3 are connected. May all of you be able to understand the connection between the 3 Dhamma, and may you be able to apply and understand the Buddha's teaching so that we can use harmoniously and seamlessly in our practice and attain insight as soon as possible. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much.